when white opens the game with d4, and black defends the center with knight f6. White's most direct and ambitious choice is to grab more space with c4. Black has a wide variety of ways to handle this position, ranging from safe, solid systems gradually fighting for equality, to razor-sharp defenses that try to wrestle the initiative away from white. If black doesn't mind accepting some serious positional risks in order to provoke immediate complications, then the disruptive Budapest gambit can make an appearance on the board with e5. At first glance, you may think this is a mouse slip, as if black intended to only advance the e-pawn one square and accidentally advanced it one square too far. In truth, black deliberately sacrifices a pawn in order to fight for a quick initiative early in the game. It's important to note that white's pawn is on c4, as this deprives the light-squared bishop of that square, making it less likely for white to create a quick kingside attack. This means that black will rapidly develop and try to create dangerous attacking chances before white is able to fully complete development. That being said, white should not fear the Budapest gambit, as careful opening play should neutralize black's early initiative, when black will have to find a way to justify this risky opening decision. Since declining the gambit does not offer any advantage to white, for example, d5 is well met with bishop c5, when black already enjoys an active position without making any concessions. White should challenge the Budapest by accepting the gambit with d takes e5. The pawn on e5 is vulnerable to attack, so black's main idea is to rapidly develop and intensify the pressure against this pawn with knight g4. White has three main responses that all challenge the Budapest in one way or another, but the tempting choice to protect the e5 pawn and attack the knight with queen d4 is not one of them. It appears black may be in some trouble, but if white becomes overly obsessed with material, it may actually be white who suddenly lands into trouble. Queen d4 is well met with d6, adding pressure against the e5 pawn while revealing the light-squared bishop's protection of the knight on g4. If white accepts the pawn with e takes d6, one option for black to explore is knight c6, continuing to rapidly develop while gaining a tempo against the queen. Another tricky option is bishop takes d6. Black is starting to build a lead in development while white's kingside remains untouched, so white should focus on addressing this issue, but since black's pawn on g7 is no longer protected, it's tempting to play queen takes g7, capturing yet another pawn and threatening the rook on h8, but this greedy approach is punished by the powerful bishop e5. The bishop protects the rook on h8, x-raying through white's queen, while also adding pressure against the b2 pawn. In order to not lose the queen outright, white can try to play queen g5, but this loses after the forced exchanges queen takes g5, bishop takes g5, and bishop takes b2, when black will collect the rook on a1 with a completely winning position. Instead of queen d4, trying to hold on to the pawn with f4 is also a poor decision, as this invites bishop c5, slicing through white's weak and dark squares. Instead of placing a pawn on f4, a much stronger as well as popular choice is the direct bishop f4, simply developing a piece and protecting the e5 pawn. Some Budapest gambiteers like to play the disruptive g5, attacking white's dark-squared bishop, as well as preparing a possible bishop g7. This is a risky choice as black compromises the kingside pawn structure in order to generate active play. The interested viewer is encouraged to examine the lines after white's strongest reply, bishop d2. In some cases, white will challenge the long diagonal with bishop c3, but another testing plan is to simply focus on development with knight c3 and fianchettoing the light-squared bishop with g3 and bishop g2, creating long-term positional pressure. In response to bishop f4, black's most common choice is knight c6, developing a piece while adding another attacker against the e5 pawn, so white naturally defends this pawn with knight f3. Black typically continues with the disruptive bishop b4 check. White has to decide how to develop the knight on b1. If white wants to avoid compromising the pawn structure, then we'll see white play knight b to d2. Now black is able to bring the queen into the action with queen e7. Black's forces surround the e5 pawn and will soon regain the material. If this line interests you as white, a simple plan is to play e3, focusing on completing development with bishop e2 and castling kingside. Instead, if white decides to challenge the dark-squared bishop with a3, many Budapest gambit players are first attracted to this opening due to this exact position, as black can ignore white's threat and play knight g takes e5. White's king looks extremely well protected, but it's actually smothered by its own pieces, so if white carelessly accepts the bishop with a takes b4, the game comes to a sudden end with knight d3. Since the pawn on e2 is pinned to the king, black delivers a smothered mate, a nasty trap to keep in mind. Instead of accepting the bishop, white initiates exchanges on e5 with knight takes e5, knight takes e5, and bishop takes e5. Now that the smothered mate trick has been eliminated, white is actually threatening a takes b4. So this is a good time for black to play bishop takes d2 check. When after the exchanges queen takes d2, and queen takes e5. In this simplified position, black can focus on castling the king, followed by playing d6, intending to develop the light-squared bishop. White is certainly not without resources as well, and one idea is to fianchetto the light-squared bishop with g3 and bishop g2, followed by castling kingside, with reasonable chances for both sides. When facing the disruptive bishop b4 check, if white wants to challenge the Budapest directly, then it's worth exploring the more active response knight c3. White's knight blocks the check from a more active square, keeping the d-file clear for the queen, which can later support the e5 pawn with queen d5. If black doesn't capture white's knight on c3 immediately, then moves such as queen b3 come to mind, adding pressure against the bishop without allowing black to compromise white's structure. So black typically initiates the exchange bishop takes c3 check, b takes c3, surrendering the bishop pair but saddling white with doubled, isolated c-pawns. Black continues to intensify the pressure against e5 with queen e7. White supports the e5 pawn while centralizing the queen with queen d5. It's important for black to play actively, because if black decides to chase after a pawn with queen a3, adding pressure against white's weakened queenside, white has the strong reply rook c1, protecting the c3 pawn while offering the a2 pawn to black. If black snatches this pawn with queen takes a2, white's lead in development and domination in the center is quite clear after h3, forcing the wayward Budapest knight to lose more time with knight h6. White should avoid trading the knight on h6 and instead focus on dominating the center with e4. If black tries to restart the knight's journey with knight g8, hoping to attack the queen from the e7 square, white has the strong response c5, taking space while offering an exchange of queens. Queen takes d5 would allow an incredible pawn mass after e takes d5, forcing black's only developed piece to retreat. And if black plays queen a3, this is well met with bishop c4, threatening checkmate on f7, forcing black's knight to the depressing d8 square. Grandmaster Sevitar Gligoric gladly demonstrated the power of white's position in these types of variations multiple times, so this is a line black should avoid. Instead of seriously falling behind in development while sending the queen on a misguided pawn hunt with queen a3, black can commit to the pawn sacrifice f6. White should accept the sacrifice with e takes f6. Black commits to a long-term pawn sacrifice in order to resolve the awkward position of the g4 knight with knight takes f6, gaining a tempo against white's queen, which can remain active in the center with queen d3. White's dark-squared bishop continues to pressure c7, so black addresses this issue with d6, restricting white's dark-squared bishop while opening up a diagonal for the light-squared bishop. One option for white is to play the straightforward e3, but another option worth considering is g3. By playing the f6 pawn sacrifice, black has opened up the f-file, so once black castles, the rook on f8 can exert pressure down the f-file. g3 protects the bishop on f4, while also preparing to create long-term positional pressure with bishop g2. White enjoys a comfortable position with two powerful bishops, challenging black to justify this pawn sacrifice. In addition to bishop f4, white sometimes prefers the quieter response knight f3. Since white has not activated the dark-squared bishop, a popular choice for black is to play bishop c5, adding pressure against the f2 pawn, provoking white to play e3. This does restrict black's dark-squared bishop, but e3 also restricts white's dark-squared bishop in the process. White will usually resolve this problem by developing this piece on the long diagonal. After e3, black continues with the typical knight c6. Unlike the bishop f4 variations, white has no interest in trying to hold on to the extra pawn, and instead continues with simple, straightforward development with bishop e2. Since there's no rush to capture the e5 pawn, black continues by castling. White's approach has a safe and solid reputation, but this does not mean black cannot create dynamic attacking chances against a careless opponent. In one master-level game, white decided to play a3, with the idea of expanding on the queen side with b4. This actually provokes a move black was planning to play anyway, a5. Preventing b4, and as we'll see, it also prepares a thematic attacking idea. White supports the queen side and prepares to fianchetto the dark-squared bishop with b3. Black centralizes the rook, adding more pressure against the center with rook e8. White supports the center and continues to develop with bishop b2. When black regains the pawn on e5, while clearing the 6th rank with knight c takes e5. As the pressure begins to mount on the king side, white decides to exchange knights with knight takes e5. Knight takes e5. White eliminates some tension from the king side and then decides to castle. So far, this game appears to be taking a slower, more positional route, but we now see why black is so eager to play a5 in the first place. This allows a dangerous rook lift with rook a6. Black's rook suddenly eyes important squares on the king side, including g6 and h6, to intensify the pressure against white's king. If white sensed the danger in this position, then centralizing the queen with queen d5, attacking the bishop and knight, would provoke an exchange of queens after queen e7 and queen takes e5, simplifying the position and eliminating any serious attacking chances for black. Instead, white continued to develop with knight c3, allowing black to swing the rook to the king side with rook h6, creating serious pressure down the h-file. White decided to centralize the knight with knight d5, revealing the dark-squared bishop's pressure down the long diagonal. Black reinforced the knight while opening up a diagonal for the light-squared bishop with d6. White's position is already slightly uncomfortable and may need to make a concession on the king side with a move like g3 to slow down black's attacking chances, but white made a fatal error with b4. After attacking black's bishop, white may have felt in control at this point, but black quickly shattered this illusion with queen h4, simply ignoring white's attack and threatening checkmate on h2. White tried to defend against this attack with h3, but now the h3 pawn is exposed, allowing black to rip open white's king side with bishop takes h3. If white captures the bishop with g takes h3, then queen takes h3 creates an irresistible attack. And if white decides to capture the other bishop with b takes c5, then bishop takes g2 tears apart white's defenses with a forced mate to follow. Instead of these fruitless captures, white tried to stay afloat with g3, attacking the queen, but this pawn move now opens up the long light-squared diagonal, allowing black to threaten checkmate once again with queen e4. Queen g2 checkmate is in the air, so white tried to block this threat with f3. Once again, as white's pawns move forward, black continues to take advantage of the space left behind. In this case, black's dark-squared bishop takes advantage of the weakened e3 pawn with bishop takes e3 check. And after knight takes e3, queen takes e3 check, white's position is suddenly collapsing, and black's powerful attack delivered a crushing victory. For example, if white plays rook f2, blocking the check but pinning the rook to the king, black has several ways to win, including rook g6, aligning with the enemy king, and attacking the unprotected pawn on g3. Defending the pawn with king h2 drops the rook on f2, followed by checkmate. And playing g4 allows another nice sacrificial shot, knight takes g4, attacking the pinned rook on f2, and if white plays f takes g4, black can play queen g3 check. As white's position collapses, checkmate is soon to follow. Rather than playing a3 immediately, provoking a5, a more popular choice for white is to simply castle. We can see a similar position develop after the moves rook e8, knight c3, and knight g takes e5. Since black is ready to play knight takes f3, preparing to meet bishop takes f3, with knight e5, attacking the bishop and c4 pawn, white will often initiate the exchange of knights with knight takes e5, and knight takes e5. Instead of spending a tempo on a3, white immediately supports the c4 pawn and prepares the fianchetto of the dark-squared bishop with b3, when black voluntarily plays a5, grabbing space on the queen side and creating the possibility for a future rook lift. Grandmaster Anish Giri has played knight a4, attacking black's dark-squared bishop and preparing to meet bishop a7 with c5, restricting black's dark-squared bishop, followed by taking over the long dark-squared diagonal with bishop b2. Against knight a4, many Budapest players prefer to play bishop f8, sending the bishop to a seemingly more passive square, but not interfering with either of black's rooks. Knight a4 is definitely a strong idea to explore, but Grandmaster Sergei Karyakin demonstrated another interesting path by centralizing the knight with knight e4, attacking black's bishop from a more centralized square. Although the knight on e4 is more active than Giri's knight a4, it is less stable from this square and is subject to a future attack. In response to knight e4, black should seriously consider bishop a7. This move does block the rook on a8, but since c5 is harder to accomplish with a less stable knight on e4, this bishop is able to maintain tension against white's kingside. That being said, his opponent, Grandmaster Nigel Short, decided to play bishop f8. White continued with bishop b2, activating the dark-squared bishop and adding pressure against black's centralized knight. If black continues with the rook lift, not only does the dark-squared bishop no longer support the kingside attack at the moment, this can be well met by queen d5, adding pressure against black's knight. Trying to provoke d6, this prevents black from swinging the rook over to the kingside. In addition to the strong and solid queen d5, black also has to be prepared for the more ambitious f4, challenging black to find sufficient counterplay as white expands in the center. Bishop b2 also sets up a small trap, as black may be tempted to play knight takes c4, capturing a pawn while revealing the rook's attack against the unprotected knight on e4. This quickly backfires as white can play bishop takes c4, preparing to meet rook takes e4, with the surprising shot bishop takes f7 check. If black plays king h8, white has regained the pawn while enjoying serious pressure against black's weakened kingside. And if black decides to play king takes f7, white should avoid queen d5 check, forking the king and rook, as this is well met by rook e6. But instead, white should play the powerful queen f3 check, winning material by forking the king and rook when white enjoys a tremendous position. Instead of falling for the trap, Grandmaster Short decided to play d6. White's knight has accomplished its task of restricting black's play, so white improves its position with knight c3. Moving the knight to a more secure square, while also eyeing the d5 post. Black developed the light-squared bishop with bishop d7, preparing to meet white's solid queen d2, with bishop c6, activating the bishop on the long light-squared diagonal, pointing directly at white's kingside. White continued to increase the pressure on the d-file with rook a to d1, when black focused on activating the dark-squared bishop with g6. White centralized the knight with knight d5, taking control of more space while restricting black's light-squared bishop and also increasing the scope of white's bishop on the long dark-squared diagonal. Grandmaster Short completed his plan with bishop g7. White's knight on d5, supported by the queen and rook, as well as the dark-squared bishop pointing directly at black's castled king, definitely leaves a positive impression. White enjoys greater potential in the center, as it's possible to expand with an eventual e4, reinforcing it with f3 if needed, or perhaps push forward with f4, grabbing more space in the center. Black is by no means helpless, but this is a reality to keep in mind. The Budapest is not always about flashy attacks, and with proper play, white can often enjoy a safe, comfortable position in which black may need to defend somewhat passive positions. In the game, Grandmaster Karyakin was able to convert this comfortable position into victory. Developing and supporting the e5 pawn with bishop f4 or knight f3 are white's main choices, but we'll briefly analyze another fascinating idea which was played by world champion Alexander Alekhine, striking in the center immediately with e4. White simply abandons the e5 pawn in order to quickly grab space in the center while attacking black's vulnerable knight on g4. White is prepared to meet the sensible knight takes e5 with f4. White grabs more space in the center while gaining another tempo against the knight. Black sometimes plays knight g6, when this knight may later be harassed by pawn advances such as f4 to f5 at a favorable moment. Another interesting idea is knight e to c6. The knight maintains greater central control than it would from the g6 square, although it does block the other knight on b8. White does not want to allow black to slice through the weakened kingside dark squares with bishop c5, so with this in mind, white usually plays bishop e3. Since bishop c5 is no longer an option, black's bishop will often develop with the disruptive bishop b4 check. This leads to sharp play in which both sides will debate over whether or not white's space-gaining central pawns are more a dynamic strength for white, or will prove to be more vulnerable targets for black to attack. If you're interested in studying dynamic, attacking chess, then you are definitely encouraged to explore these lines. Although knight g4 is by far black's most popular choice, black may also try knight e4. This opening is known as the Feyerowicz gambit, an even riskier choice than the typical Budapest lines we examined. Attacking this vulnerable knight with queen c2 is a natural idea, but black can play bishop b4 check, provoking interesting complications. White has a variety of options that can be explored, but a simple path to follow is restraining black's activity with a3. Preventing a quick bishop b4, while also preparing to expand with b4, followed by fianchettoing the bishop on the long dark squared diagonal. The interested viewer can explore options such as a5, discouraging b4, when white can follow through with the idea of queen c2, attacking the vulnerable knight. It's also possible for black to commit to a long-term pawn sacrifice with d6. But one straightforward line to consider is knight c6, knight f3, bishop c5, and e3. With the knight on e4 instead of g4, there is less pressure against the e5 pawn, making black's position more difficult to justify. b4 is now a serious issue, but if black tries to prevent it with a5. In this case, the cure is worse than the disease, as this loses a piece to queen d5, when black cannot properly defend against the double attack against the bishop and knight. The Budapest gambit is a risky, dynamic weapon against d4. It's important to keep in mind that this is not a standalone defense, as it relies upon white to play c4 on the second move, which is white's most popular as well as ambitious choice. If white chooses not to take this gambit seriously, it can lead to quick wins for black, but as long as white acknowledges this opening has a right to exist and cannot be directly refuted, there are multiple ways for white to gain a more comfortable position. The Budapest can be an interesting surprise weapon to experiment with as black, and after watching this video, white should have a good foundation upon which to build in order to challenge this risky opening choice.